Hello and welcome to another episode of Tales and Tactics Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. You know, we go through the book and we read it and then discuss the things and, all that stuff. Join us as we dive into the games you know and love, and maybe we'll find a few that you haven't ever even heard of. I am joined, of course, by my co-host, Troy. I am Max, and working behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. And today's episode is a special one that I made sure to go well out of my way to play it, because it is more than a game in this case of a topic. It is more of a phenomena, ecosystem. It's an entire line of games, essentially. And that goes by so many names. Some people call it Classic Dungeons and Dragons. Some people call it Basic Expert or BX Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a whole reason for why it's called that. Original, but that's tying back to OD&D. But when you learn about the history of that, you can see why that can be confused with this. You know, the Moldvay to the Cook to the Mentzer versions, and beyond that to the revival and all of the OSR, essentially, or at least some of the OSR, I should say. Before I dive into the history therein, Troy, what did you think of our little test?
My experience with D&D dates back to 2nd edition advanced D&D, played in the mid-90s, or the early side of the mid-90s. And I had a lot of fun with that as a child, really embracing the imagination side. This is going back even further than that in my experience, and it completely hit me with an imagination hammer. The scope of play is so cool. The feel of the rules being both really easy to grok with as a player, but still having depth on the GM side was really rewarding, because we played with some people who were only familiar with 5e and modern role-playing, if even that. So it was really cool to have this level of open expression for your action set that was super cool, but still had a crunch and a consequence that came back to you because of the level of investment on the GM side. So I thought that really worked. And just the simple, straightforward, get rich or die trying mentality that game has really felt like, as a low-level character, I knew what I wanted to do, which was get gold to get experience, to get a better blade at my side, because I know what's out there and it's going to get me.
Just for reference on our play test, I found a pre-written adventure. I won't say what, but it's good and everybody loves it. And it's mostly just not to spoil anyone who's playing the game so they don't accidentally look it up, which I don't think they will, but whatever. And then I used the Old School Essentials, which is a rewritten file off the serial numbers version of mainly the BX, so the Basic Expert set by Moldvay and Cook. And I also used those rules as well for supplement. But while I was doing that, I flipped through both the Holmes Basic and the Mentzer BECMI system. And finally got to the Rules Cyclopedia, which turned out to be the treasure at the end of the rainbow. But I'll get into that later.
The sweet, chewy center, yeah.
Oh, I know, yeah. So, original Dungeons & Dragons is selling like hotcakes throughout the 70s since it had come out. And the TSR company is trying to keep up with this, and they're excited, and they're putting out books. And obviously, they got the Greyhawk book, and they got the other expansions and a lot of the other stuff for the original set. And this inspired a lot of people. One of those people was a Mr. Holmes, Eric Holmes, who was perhaps among other things, among being an enthusiast of Dungeons & Dragons, was a psychologist and an author. Seems like a decent fit for an era where game designer was something that you kind of stumbled into. I believe it went this way, that he proposed the idea of creating a simpler version of the game for a younger player base as a kind of on-ramp to playing the game, whereby he discovered that Gary Gygax was also working on an advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So this would be your AD&D first edition, as a way to clarify a lot of the rules and add ones and unify the system rather than everybody playing their own version. So that idea seemed appealing because obviously the version of the game he was working on and the existing game were impenetrable to some people. And having a simpler version of the game as a starting point, especially for kids, seemed appealing. So he lent his support to that. I believe, at least from some of my reading, that Gary also guided it to be more of an on-ramp for AD&D. But obviously the reason for Eric Holmes to be there was because he was inspired by OD&D, so it kind of serves a dual purpose. That version of the game only goes to level 3, I believe.
That's really interesting, actually, that it's got such like an introductory cap to it. But the first 3 levels really do show you the concept of role playing, if not what the scope of your class is.
Yeah, and if the whole idea was to get you to get the AD&D set, and then you'd be introduced to a whole other range of rules. And that's the thing is with the Holmes Basic and AD&D, they really do plug in together. And over time, that's going to stop being a thing, actually pretty quickly. That edition does amazingly with sales. I don't know if it outsold... No, yeah, it outsold original Dungeons & Dragons in like a month what it had sold in its entire time up to that point, or something equivalent to that.
Wow.
I don't have the exact numbers, but it kicked off. The main thing that Holmes brought to it was just better, easier to understand writing, i.e. not Gygaxian writing.
I understand what you mean by that. I certainly do.
Gary's idea is that, this is not my quote, but if it took 3 words to say something, then he was going to use 6.
That intimidation of language was a huge reason why I didn't think I could be a GM for a lot of my youth and adolescence. Is I was like, I don't know how this works. I can never run this. And then one day you read a different rule set or you get your head around it or whatever. But I always remember that type of language being both part of what drew me into it because of like the magic of that vocabulary, but also it keeps you at arm's length unless you're like already in the fold, so to speak.
So that was super popular, and this was in 1977, and the AD&D set, I believe, came out the same year, but a little later. So they were essentially built in parallel. Fast forward to 1981, a number of things have obviously come out. The first edition line is well on its way to be developed and all this stuff. And they look back on the original one and are like, okay, well, let's do that again. Like, let's put it out, but let's try to tighten it up a bit, and we'll put out a nice box set for it. So Tom Moldvay, I can't remember his exact credentials. He is one of the staff at TSR. He may have come over from Dragon, or I might be thinking of Cook. Sorry, Dragon Magazine, if anyone's wondering. So the idea was to take the Holmes one, and it still went to level 3, but basically revise it, simplify the rules, but maintain a lot of the direction with the language, right?
Yeah.
It cut back a lot of stuff. It had less spells, I guess, to not paralyze people with choice. And this is where it starts. Some of the revisions start to make this edition of Dungeons & Dragons kind of its own thing, but it wouldn't really become that until a little later. And then Cook is then brought in to make what is called Expert, which is supposed to take you from levels 4 to 14. Later, this was intended to be followed by a master set that would take you from, I think, levels 15 to 36, 34, something like that. But that didn't end up happening because TSR is famous for its stops and starts and things getting totally swept aside. The second one basically brought in the idea of wilderness survival, hex crawling, all of that stuff, and it built onto that. It brought in more character options. It brought in some ideas around domain play.
Hex crawling to me is really a huge part of D&D in my imagination. Like getting to the dungeon is as important as being in the dungeon for a gamer like me. And I think perhaps that comes from the fact that I played later editions of D&D where that was sort of taken for granted. But it's really interesting to imagine a time where you didn't have that, and then that came in to your play a little bit later.
And this, again, being even though it's described as the Expert box set, I'm going to say it was a little bit more simple than, say, like any of the additional modules that were then coming out for AD&D.
Right. Okay.
So, there had already been rule expansions. Oh, and also, this is where we get the beginnings of what is known as the known world, but probably, well, I don't know if this is better understood or whatever the case may be, but the setting of Mystara, which I will never do a lore video on, because there is a channel out there called Mr. Welch. If anyone has not heard of this, it is the most in-depth, comprehensive breakdown of that setting anyone will ever need ever. And he's very entertaining to listen to.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
So I would just direct you to that if you're interested in that, because I'm not doing that. I don't know enough about it. He clearly knows everything about it. So we'll leave it at that.
Right.
The most I could take away about Mystara is that it is delightfully eccentric and weirdly well thought out as compared to something like Forgotten Realms. It seemed to be existing in it, much like this game. It existed in its own little corner, almost invisible to even the people who played it, because it was so interwoven with the basic set of the game. But then they would release Gazetteers, or what are referred to as the Gazetteer series, which actually expands and develops the setting so that those that cottoned onto it then began to understand what it was. And it, oh my God, the world is so bizarre.
That's wild.
I'll go as far as to say the thing that drew me into it, like I knew about it, but I didn't know what it was called, because I knew it was called the known world, but I didn't know it was like a full-on setting. But then somehow I backdoored my way into it when I learned about the Hollow Earth and how there's this really bizarre subsetting inside of the setting that's inside a hollow world, which is the world.
That's cool. Wow.
And that one is kind of like a Lost World theming, with dinosaurs and stuff like that. But it also has like preserved cultures and weird metaphysics that like keep all of the preserved cultures from change. Oh, it's so bizarre. I won't even get into it. Just watch his videos. It's wild.
Okay.
All right. So back to the main deal. So this, again, sells super well, goes on to sell a bajillion copies or whatever it did. And now we're getting more specific modules for it as well.
Okay.
Which, again, come into this known world concept. So if you're going to write adventures for something and you want them to feel cohesive, you're going to have to make it feel like it's a real place. So they settled on a setting that they developed over time. Then finally, you get the third edition of the game, which is created by Frank Mentzer and is more famously referred to as the BECMI line, on account of the 5 sets that came out for it are referred to as Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, and Immortals. And that would give you the acronym BECMI. And each one of those incrementally builds on the last one. And in a lot of ways, they are just essentially the rules from the previous edition, but again, with more clarity and obviously this staggered progression. And this is true of all of them, is that there was this writing mentality at one point. Sometimes this gets brought up in the history of Dungeons & Dragons when they were talking about AD&D, and I think 2nd edition especially, is the difference between a reference book and an instruction book. Do you have any idea what the difference of those two might be? Because I had to actually kind of ponder this out.
No, I don't. What is that?
So a reference book is essentially, if you want to look up the rules, it's like a textbook in a lot of ways. It has all the things you need written in a priority that you can find them as you need them. Probably has a procedure for creating a character and all this other stuff. However, there was a popular trend in instructional writing where you would learn by effectively playing the game and having the game add rules in as you played it.
Oh, interesting.
So it was a learn as you go. And a lot of the products, especially from the Moldvay Cook editions going forward, fell into this idea that the game would teach you one step at a time. So you would introduce rules as they appeared based on the adventure that was baked into the game. And I have a copy of the basic set, like the BECMI basic set. And yeah, it has basic character creation, which has, all of your classes. It has your methods for rolling stats, things for getting equipment, and then it's got this little dungeon that you go through, and it gives you an explanation of how each of these things and how to run it, what the players might do, all that. And it's done in this sort of step-for-step kind of thing. And the BECMI version is the most in line with that because each separate set adds on to the previous one, because the first one goes from levels 1 to 3, the next one goes from 4 to 14, the next one goes 15 to 25, then the master set is 26 to 36, and then Immortal is anything above 36. Immortals is the one that I've seen least reprinted, but it also is the one that specifically ties into the setting of Mystara, because instead of gods, they have immortals.
Oh, interesting.
So in a way, it's kind of like the deities and demigods concept for the known world.
Kind of sounds like Exalted even.
Yeah, well, Exalted's got a different vibe altogether, but in some ways, yes. I think it would be comparable to something like epic level play from 3rd edition. But in this particular case, you are actually, you ascend to like a divine status, and you have godlike powers which you can bestow onto mortals.
It's kind of wild.
It's like domain play, but now it's like mythical domain play.
Yeah. So now it's like you have followers and like cultishness going on around you.
Yeah, and you define yourself as like a god, and it's very specific to that setting.
But it's kind of neat, though. It's a very novel concept to reach divinity and then the game change and not just kind of stop at that point where you join the Pantheon. The game actually kind of has stuff for you to do in that Pantheon.
Well, and until very recent editions of the game, I guess it started to fade around 3.5, but it was still sort of there as an option. But around 4th and 5th edition, the idea of higher levels of play kind of just disappeared. Because there used to be like mass combat rules. In fact, one game that we want to cover, because it's both flawed, but it also plays into the idea of mass combat in D&D, is Battle System, which is a miniatures war game for D&D that didn't do very well. And I'm curious to find out why.
Battle System would be one I want to spend a little bit of time looking at too, just for my own wargamer edification. But there's 2 editions and a skirmish version of it, and it works like a mass combat game. So there's got to be some interest. Yeah.
So anyway, back onto the thing. So these sets imitate the 2 previous sets. It's almost like, you got basic, and there's this promise of having another version of it. And then when they do the other version, they redo the basic and they set out the next one, but then that dies off. And then I guess the thing that people appreciate about the BECMI edition is that it saw that concept from beginning to end. It wasn't any false starts. I find that a lot of the OSR crowd has a bit of a preference for the Moldvay Cook. And it's hard to explain why, because that one cut out a lot of stuff from the Holmes one. But then I've seen a lot of OSR products like OSE or Labyrinth Lord, Labyrinth Lord is a little bit more based on AD&D in some ways, but that they kind of amalgamate all of those together and then pick and choose the rules that they think are relevant to the revised version that they're putting out. Same as before, the second set, Wilderness, Strongholds, that kind of thing. Also includes Isle of the Dead, which is considered the beginnings of the known world. Then you have the companion set. This is where you get your mass combat rules, your domain play, rulership, basically running a country. It's kind of crazy that like the 3rd set and you're already up at this point. Then you get the master set, and you're like high level, like planar travel, high level magic, battles against demigods, and then obviously Immortals, which turns you into effectively a god. I don't know that you can do much at that. I mean, there's a whole game built around it, so obviously you can do something. That all comes out between 83 and 86. And yeah, it's what the most fondly remembered, but I honestly think that a lot of it's built off of those previous editions' success, and then it being a recognizable version of those things.
Now, out of that list, where do you have the strongest association? Is it the BECMI? Is that the one that connects with you the most because of its completeness? Or is there something about one of the earlier iterations that's better in its execution, maybe?
So the one I'm most familiar with is the BECMI Basic and Expert, especially.
Is that Red Box?
Red and Blue Box, yeah.
Yeah, because Red Box is the only one of the past that I've ever played from OD&D before our playtest here.
And it's an iconic thing that they've reprinted, especially recently. I've seen it in game stores even like this year. And these are obviously holdovers, but I'm just saying they made enough of them. They're not. I don't know if they're in print anymore. Maybe they are. So those are the ones that I most associate with. And then, so I bought mine at a yard. I guess it was like a yard sale, effectively. I think it was a flea market, an indoor flea market at a community center. And I recognized the red box, and then I saw the blue one, and I realized that was connected to that. And it had always been something lurking in the back of my head, but then I actually had it. I could look through it. I still have the dice. They're still my favorite dice because they're all different colors, and they all really I don't know, they just pop.
That's pretty badass.
And it makes sense because you have a color for every die, so it's easy to remember. You can distinguish them not just from their shape. And then later on, I looked into it and then found out that there were 3 more games that expanded on this one, on those 2. And then I started reading them. I'm like, these are crazy. I'm pretty sure you just need these first 2 to do most stuff.
Yeah, I get that.
And then at the very, very end of the line, they release, I think it's, I'm going to check the book itself because I want to be 100% on this date. Yep, 1991. They release the Rules Cyclopedia, which effectively digests down the BECMI set, basic through to master, leaving Immortal out of it. Oh, and it also includes more additional Mystara stuff in it. It also expands a ton of things. It adds a few more classes. It has the best, in my opinion, the best proficiency rules of all, beats the pants off the ones in 2nd edition, which were pretty good, actually, before they got into skills in 3rd. Yeah, it just creates a really it's like an the Rules Cyclopedia feels like an alternate world version of AD&D because it's almost as complex. It is effectively an entire rule system in one book.
Right.
It had an incredibly short run, but it's literally looking like it's D&D from a parallel universe, and some of it makes a lot more sense because it's coming from that slimmed down, let's make it easy, but then that complexity builds back into it, and then it has a different tone. That's the best way I can describe it. And I was reading through it, and I'm like, man, some of these rules are kind of amazing.
It's got some cool stuff, eh?
It's the thoughtfulness behind it, because I've also been reading my way through 2nd edition, which is supposed to be a cleaned up version of original D&D, which changes very little, but takes a lot of ideas that had been built up and makes them more core, like proficiencies, especially non-combat or non-weapon proficiencies. Both of these games do that, but they do them in subtly different ways, where the ones in 2nd edition AD&D feel a little bit tacked on, whereas the ones in Rules Cyclopedia feel really integral and make fighters way more unique. And it's, from a design perspective, the best way I can describe it is, so the problem with fighters, as you might be aware, Troy, in Dungeons & Dragons especially, is that eventually they get outclassed by pretty much all the magic users, especially wizards.
They can even be outclassed by high proficiency or high skill guys who can just do more stuff than them.
Pretty well. I mean, the fact that they keep improving their combat bonuses. But one of the things that Rules Cyclopedia does as a little bit of a different rule option or different approach is that it makes getting weapon proficiencies much more like a skill-based thing that actually gives you a lot of payoffs the more you buy into it. And fighters can buy into it the most. So the best way I could describe it is that it makes combat more in favor of the fighters by in some ways restricting it from the other classes, but it also allows other classes more flexibility in purchasing weapon proficiencies. So you're not just locked into, the wizard can only use a staff and a dagger, but it goes with the idea that, the fighter can buy in more on these things and get more of the benefits, but it also opens it up so the wizard can learn to use a sword if they want. So it's like the best of both worlds, whereas the one in second edition, ignoring combat and tactics, which is got a lot of really cool ideas in it as well, and kind of fixes some of those things. But yeah, the weapon proficiencies don't feel quite as integral. And in fact, they're considered optional in second edition AD&D.
That seems crazy they're optional. They seem important to what makes a fighter distinct.
They don't dig into it as much as the Rules Cyclopedia does. So in a sense, because they're like, oh yeah, and like that's a thing that you could do if you wanted to, where like you could purchase more weapon abilities, and you can get weapon specialization, which essentially allows you to buy the same weapon twice, and that gives you an improvement.
Okay.
But it doesn't have the sophisticated level of advance. Like, for instance, in Rules Cyclopedia, if you take that rule, you uncouple weapon ability from leveling in a lot of ways. But because you're getting proficiencies per level, it ties it back in. Because I've never found a good skill system. Like, I always found the third edition skills to be overwrought. I found the fourth edition skills to barely exist. Fifth edition sort of tries to split the difference, but it always comes across as secondary, where I thought they were important, but then third edition made the problem of making them feel like they got in the way. And there were so many skills.
Yeah, truly.
Not that that's a bad thing. I like variety, but without a cohesive system, it feels like bloat. That is the history of the line. I guess we're going to go through our standard procedure for these episodes. So the material, the art in the first two books is crude, but effective and certainly fitting of things. I find the art in the Holmes one to be very similar to OD&D, and for better or worse, whatever you may feel of that.
Okay.
The cover is pretty iconic, but, you know, maybe a bit amateurish for my taste. Some of the interior art is better. It's got a lot of that cartooniness that exists at that time. So you have like, I don't know, like Munchkin-like cartoons.
Guys getting scared by spiders and stuff. Yeah.
Alongside like more visceral or sketchy art. You know, again, that kind of art has a charm to it. And in fact, some of the diagrams are practically pieces of art in themselves. Then you get the Moldvay cook, a bit more refined, albeit like, I like the colorfulness of the cover. It's going bold, almost psychedelic. It's got like a dragon and a warrior and a sorceress looking character and some treasure. Yeah, I don't know. It's really brightly colored, but it's definitely got this sort of acid drenched fantasy thing going on.
Yeah, yeah.
The interior art is a lot sharper. And yeah, this one's got like Jeff D and Errol Otis and like, you know, more known contributors to D&D, especially for like later projects, especially for adventure modules, to be honest. The layout on this one is a little clearer, whereas the other one is really fine text, but does the job. This one, a little bit more spacing and a little bit more clear object, like this is what a character sheet looks like. Here's how alignment works, so on and so forth. Some interesting differences from other D&D products. This only has 3 alignments. Race is a class and has its own progression. And that, I think, in some ways is what that proficiency system was trying to compensate for, is like, well, what if I want to play a halfling thief and a halfling is the only class? Well, then you can take non-weapon proficiencies that will make you better at pickpocketing and stuff like that. So you could kind of build your race class with those other features. But as I said, that's a later thing. You pretty much just play it as is at this point. But yeah, it's got a little bit of everything, and that's kind of what you want for something to introduce the concept of the game. And then you get the BECMI, which I would argue has some of the nicest art in any D&D product.
That's cool.
Yeah, who did the primary interior art on this? Oh, well, okay. So yeah, it's Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley. So I was like, that looks familiar, and I should know that. So they are like classic peak TSR artists doing their thing, really getting that 80s fantasy vibe. It's fantastic. It's obviously more sheared down, but it's got everything and an adventure to get started. So who's arguing? And then they just keep going through all of those books. And then the Rules Cyclopedia it's two-tone coloring, 3-column printing. It's a lot more analytical, but definitely not unapproachable. And the craziest thing is that it's written as Rules Cyclopedia, which undercuts the fact that one book is an entirely playable system from beginning to end. It sounds like a supplement, but it is in fact secretly a core book. It's just a weird naming. Dungeons and Dragons Rules Cyclopedia sounds like a reference book, and it is, but everything you'd ever need to play in this entire line of games is in that book, plus a bunch of other stuff. It's got all your classes. It's got more classes. It's got the Mystic, which I believe is sort of like the monk in AD&D. Oh, and it's got a druid class finally in this set, because a lot of the stuff that was in AD&D did port over into the classic line until later.
Can you explain that to me? Like, what became the difference between the BX, the BECMIs, and the AD&Ds? Was there like different stats, or was it more just a different assignment of the consistent stats, so to speak?
So, like, when you get down to the math of it, it's not really that different. They both use like a THACO system. It's more or less described the same way, with like the little tracking lookup chart on your sheet and stuff like that. They're not using the tables as much. Well, okay, so AD&D uses the tables. THACO, as we understand it, is more of a second edition sort of reframing of that. But the math is exactly the same. Monsters are more or less interchangeable. The saves are basically the same. As I said, second edition creates a further separation between these. But between first edition AD&D and this game, the numerical values are pretty interchangeable. AD&D adds other stuff, like, for instance, alignment is more complex. They also have a lot of other qualities with monsters, like not just with grouping, but like chance to find in lair, chance to find in wild.
Okay.
You're just getting more information that the other game might not be able to have a resolution for. As you go further into it, they begin, the real difference becomes how they resolve different things.
Oh, okay. So a different application of the existing core attributes, but to do the same thing that the other book does, it just uses them differently.
The math is the same, but the language and the method is slightly different. And each edition they're figuring out the same problem in a different way. But with not that much conversion, you can kind of fold one into the other. That was, in fact, the thing that I found interesting about the module that I'm running for you guys, was that I believe it was originally for Labyrinth Lord, which uses a little bit more AD&D DNA in it, but it translated pretty easily. And a lot of it was me just ignoring stuff.
Right.
Even though I'm using OSE, I actually will probably be kind of folding in more of this Rules Cyclopedia stuff, because I honestly think this is the better game. Not to say that OSE is an amazing product. Don't get me wrong. Necrotic Gnome people are fantastic in their production, especially if you want to get physical copies. Small, digest-sized hardbacks, really good quality, come in box sets. They got a little bit hairy and confusing with the what book to start with, because they have an advanced and a basic version, which I guess is supposed to mirror these. And then they have like a full rules compendium that puts all of them in one book. I do recommend them, but do your research. There's a lot of videos out there that do a good job. I think Questing Beast did a good one on differentiating which versions contain what. There's things that I really like about AD&D, but sometimes it feels overwrought. And I know that it was the fullest and most complete thing. And some of the ways that it resolves are things that Basic Expert just doesn't touch, or they have a different way of doing it. But it's almost like, it's like a subspecies of the same game. They both come out of original Dungeons and Dragons, and then they begin to evolve slightly along different lines. But like a subspecies before it becomes a different species entirely, they can still, you'll pardon the analogy, they can still interbreed and create fruitful offspring. They're not so differentiated that they're now infertile to each other. They can still exchange ideas. And in fact, a lot of what the OSR thing is taking some elements, some ways that AD&D has resolved stuff. I mean, our following episode of this one is going to just be talking freeform about what the hell is the old school Renaissance or old school revival. I mean, even that is in contention. So enough said. A lot of what those versions that I was flipping through are kind of just different people who are picking. So they must have been familiar with one of these types. Particularly, the basic expert seems to be a lot of the core element of it. And then they're putting in AD&D stuff. The big exception to this is actually the granddaddy of all of them, which is Osric, which is more or less an AD&D in all but name, and almost verbatim, in fact. And then there's basic fantasy, which I think is also another interpretation that takes some of its interpretations from AD&D, but also blends in other stuff. And then you get your OSE and your Labyrinth Lord and, geez, there's tons of... And then there's the OSR adjacent stuff like Dungeon Crawl Classics or Knave or, you know...
Stars Without Number and stuff like that. Worlds Without Number.
Yeah, Stars Without Number. It's more of like the spirit of the thing and not so much a literal dictation and editing of the thing itself. We'll get into the levels of depth and the areas of contention because it's as bad as a music genre, in my opinion. At least when it comes to the people wanting to argue semantics.
Yeah, exactly.
So the game that we ran was Troy, Jay, my wife, and Troy's wife. Everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah. It worked.
My wife doesn't play role-playing games all that much. I think she may have played like a total of 3 times, but she enjoyed the experience and she's even down to do it again. You know, maybe not as enthusiastically as everyone else, but that was a good sign in my opinion. And she liked how easy it was and that she didn't have to think about what she had to do, but like, you know, she could just say it and kind of figure out her character and it wasn't too serious, but it was just serious enough, you know. What were your impressions?
My big takeaway was the ability to get to grips with the character faster because you just roll less stuff. The character creation was so much easier that I didn't have to spend this huge investment of like, well, who is this guy? What's he doing? Like the role play felt more natural because it came out of the decisions in play rather than like having to pre-plot this complicated guy over 44 different skills.
Yeah. And you had just come off playing 5th edition, running one, I should say.
Yeah, I'd been running 5 and I just finished that campaign and it was a lot of fun. But I would say it was more fun because of the people I did it with than perhaps the 5th edition itself. 5th edition is very proficient at what it does, but I don't think it's the fantasy that I want. Because in this, this is sort of a brief tangent, but I think the problem with games like 5th edition and stuff, it's that they're based on the stories that people tell each other about RPGs, not the actual playing of RPGs that then creates those stories.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say? Like the mechanical verisimilitude and complexity of something like 5th edition just isn't really there to create something really robustly dynamic through your play experience. It relies on a degree of pre-plotted authorship to produce satisfying outcomes. And I felt in this old school mentality, the fun is in what happens to you. It's not in what the GM thought of the night before. It's not in some 250-page book that's a story arc that we're all just playing through. It's instead in these moment-to-moment choices and the immediate, often deadly consequences that follow them.
And I think your instinct about how it's 5th edition is more based on the expectation of previous people's experiences.
Yeah.
And how in older editions, well, I mean, once you get around to 2nd edition, now you're getting more of the plot-driven play. But even if you read some of those adventures, they're not really written too hard in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this idea that, especially from like much older versions, where like these really cool stories would come out of it. And so through a weird game of sort of expectation telephone, that becomes the hard-coded thing. Like we have to make that happen as opposed to let that happen and have like I much prefer this style of D&D because I like location-based adventures where my first thing is to have the entire, like, I love me a mega dungeon with a town and a wilderness area with a few other cool things. And then I can have characters move around that space while between sessions. So it's not just about like, there's motives, but those motives, I'll often roll dice when I'm like, oh, the snake men infiltrate the town, and I roll to see if that's successful, and they're not. And so when the players come back, there's like a dead lizard man nailed up to a door.
Right.
I'm thinking about these guys have a motive and a plot that they're trying to enact, and these characters will react in a certain way. And in a weird game, I'm playing a solo game with factions and just random characters between sessions because it's fun and it makes stuff happen when the players come back to their next session.
I totally agree with that.
You know, and I lean even more into that. I just like the idea that the world feels like a living world that has, you know, plots and intrigues happening in it, but that the players are just the players in the place. And it's nice to have the dungeon as a focus. It's one of the reasons I like the mega dungeon concept, is because if you got nothing else to do and you don't want to figure out any of that or mess with it, you can always go into the dungeon and make some money.
And that's a big part of this era of D&D, is that you're trying to get wealth and you're trying to plumb the depths of a scary place and pull back some gold and some gems. And it gives you an immediate thing to do without you having to think of like some grand plot to destroy a ring or something. You know, you're just sort of going into a crypt and you're going to take the gems off the skeleton. But as we found, when you do that, the skeleton comes alive and tries to kill you. I
agree with you. And it's a big pet peeve of mine about how characters are handled, in the sense that, well, one of my biggest turnoffs from 5th edition is that it's a superheroes game. But when I play fantasy, when I think Dungeons and Dragons and I want to play Dungeons and Dragons, I'm not thinking that. And I like supers games, don't get me wrong, but I want to know that that's what I'm playing. So I'd rather play like something that's more like a supers game, like, well, Mutants and Masterminds, even Numenera. Numenera itself is a little bit, it's a cool idea with not a lot of legs. But the Cypher system works really well as a supers game. And then you have like Exalted and Scion, if you want to play that kind of like godlike beings, if you want that fantasy superhero thing.
Yes.
Because those games are really geared to that. Whereas 5th edition doesn't really feel, it doesn't fit my expectation of what the game is supposed to be. And I know that's an opinion, but it also isn't really buying into the whole, like, let's get crazy and play really powerful characters with lots of influence and you're a hero out of the box. And actually, Matt Colville's Draw Steel seems to be doing more of that commitment. I haven't read it yet. It's weird. I agree with him on so many things, but when it comes down to the kind of game that he would make and the kind of game that I would make, it's not even close. But that's fine. I think he's doing a really good job with that. Even if it's not something that immediately appeals to me, I appreciate that he has a vision for that that's not watered down, and like that high level superhero, you're important right from the get-go thing. That's great, right? Like at least he's got the courage of his convictions.
Yeah. And I mean, it's again different than, say, Daggerheart, which is more like interpersonal stories in a D&D context, right?
Theater kid D&D. And I don't mean that derisively.
But in a sense, yeah, like it's about that more personal side of the game, like where Draw Steel is very, very much like, oh, we're going to have a super fun superhero D&D game, but we're going to do it on a grid, and I'm going to knock you back 4 grid squares. It really has that presence to it, to where when we played this, like we played it relationally, like we played it not on like a grid, but sort of on a map, kind of a grid map. And like, it made sense that it really helped understand certain things and it gave it a sense, but in no way was it like, I'm moving here for the flank modifier. That didn't come up. And that's specifically what I like.
But I was thinking about those things because, so your combat, just to kind of get into this before we finish, because I thought this was an interesting thing. So the rules are loose and interpretive enough, especially emphasized by Old School Essentials, which is interesting because it has really, really excellent procedures for running an adventure. But it also has a very, not make it up, but interpret the rules as you need it. So I had them fighting giant scorpions in the desert, and the fighter was doing a spear and shield thing, and Jay, being the classic, let's be a boss-ass hero, jumps between him and the weaker characters of the party. And I'm like, okay, well, what does a scorpion have? Well, the scorpion is animalistic, and it's looking at its shield. So I had it grab his shield, and then I remembered that the stinger is kind of reaching around, so I took away his shield bonus because it's hitting in from above.
Oh.
And it made no one argued. It painted a picture in your head, and that penalty to his defense, where also he had to then make the decision about what to do because he's being held in place by the scorpion. So he either has to drop his shield or in his case, he decided to ram into it. But yeah, it's it has a simple enough system that you can just follow the logic and be like, well, I feel that this makes sense. And I'm pretty upfront about that. I told him, well, the usefulness of the shield based on your inability to move it and the fact that the attack is coming in from above. And he's like, yeah, that makes sense. Right. And it's like, well, I guess I underestimated the enemy. Even though it was suboptimal to the combat, everybody was able to get into it more, including Jay.
I really enjoyed how easily the mechanics and the narrative supported each other. The simplicity of just what do you do? I guess we walk over there. What's there? I don't know. Maybe I'll try and open that with my hands. Oh, I can't. Well, I have a tool. Maybe I'll try and pry it. It's this simple base principles approach to role-playing and the verbs that you use that I found eminently satisfying in a way where, coming from something as abstracted as 5th edition, something as improvisational and abstract as 5th edition, where there isn't anything there. It's like, what's behind that door? I don't know. Whatever is appropriate for the moment. Not really like old style in most applications where what's behind that door, something considered. And I think, again, that's a different approach, but I found that dungeoneering and that ability to just express my character intent without needing a lot of rules, but the rules still exist on your side, was very rewarding as a player experience. So I was sold on this model. I've liked old school role-playing in OSR for a long time, but this was my first time going back as far as a BX experience. And yeah, I could see myself running this for sure. I probably wouldn't run 5 again, even though it was fun. I just didn't get the experience out of it that I wanted as a game master. So I think running something like this would be way more my style of game, where, like you said, there's almost those faction turns you're playing out and some of those details, which are so much more interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of good methodology in that system that could apply to any system. Now, that said, and I want to do this more often, there are things about this system that I don't like.
Hit me. Let me know.
Okay, so a lot of people are going to be, well, it uses THAC0. Nope. Not a huge problem. Do you want to know a really easy trick to doing THAC0?
Yes.
For those that don't know, THAC0 stands for 2-hit armor class 0. Is effectively the way to use armor class that counts in negatives. So armor class goes from 10 to -10, and the lower it is, the better. And the way that this works is you roll your die, you add your modifiers to the die, then you take the armor class and subtract it from the THAC0, which at a starting level in this game is 19. In AD&D, it's 20. And if the die plus modifiers beats it, then you hit. Okay, but the problem with that is people are like, what? I have to subtract one number and then see if it matches another? No, you don't. And this is my favorite trick about getting through THAC0. If you want to play it just rules as written out of the box, this is how you do it. Your player rolls their die. They add their modifiers to the die. And then, and this is the fun part, behind the screen, you add the monster's AC to the die as well. And if that beats the fixed THAC0 number for that player, which you will also have written down behind the screen, of course, then they hit.
Perfect.
Simple as. There's no subtraction. You just take the value that you would have subtracted from the THAC0 and add it to the die instead. It's the same math. You're just moving the equation over.
Yeah, it works really well. I found it a very elegant solution to that.
It's dirt easy. So like anybody who's sweating it about like having to do subtraction and weird math, no, you don't. And even if you did, a lot of the sheets have a little tracking table if you want a shorthand for that. So my point is THAC0 has never been a concern to me. I used to do it the old way. Now I do it like this. And if I have to explain it to somebody, that's how I do explain it. For me, it's two things. One of them is simple. I hate the saving throws.
Okay, yeah.
They're too specific.
Death, wand, stave. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah. Spell save makes a little bit of sense. There's like paralysis and poison. I guess you can kind of see that as being related. But then you have breath weapon on its own, and there's other things. And I just don't know. Like, there doesn't seem to be a good enough reason why they're differentiated from each other. So it just sort of seems really unnecessarily Baroque. The other thing, and this is more the concern that I have, because I can deal with that. As long as the adventures written for the system use the same saving throws, who cares? My biggest problem is that it uses a bunch of different systems other than the D20. So it's got like skill systems that are on a percentile die. But wait, some of those skill percentages increase in increments of 5%, so they could have been done on a D20.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Or just weird rules that the ranger on your class had a rule where they had to give up all of their riches after they purchased necessary equipment. So you couldn't have more than 1 gold on your person, essentially, sort of was the vibe. And I was like,
yeah.
I get that you're trying to do like a Robin Hood thing, but I don't see enough in the rules to explain a lore reason why that would be the case. It seems just like arbitrary balance, like the fact that the Barbarian, which doesn't exist in the original BAX game, but exists in OSE, and is based on the AD&D Barbarian. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but the fact that they hate magic. But they did make the exception for clerical magic, at least in OSE, that they don't hate that, where it was like Barbarians in AD&D, like they had to get to a certain level before they could even share space with a cleric in the party. If people think that the assassin was adversarial, that is way more coded to be against party dynamics.
Right.
At least the assassin could join the party, even if they optionally could murder them.
I like that. Yeah.
Right. But the barbarian's like, oh, there's a wizard there? Pfft, well, no, I'm not in it.
Now, I want to get you with this question here as we approach the end of our show. When you compare this to some of the other games you've run more recently or other Dungeons & Dragons you're familiar with, how does this sit in your hierarchy of what to run next?
That's a good question. Well, as I said, I would like to continue to run the campaign or the module. It ultimately will be a campaign because it's big. But I think I will start gravitating it to the Rules Cyclopedia because I am quite taken with this nice middle. So like, that's the thing. And I've mentioned this in other episodes, and it might seem weird to people that I'm covering basic D&D, but I like crunch. I don't like crunch that is cumbersome or unnecessary, but I do like when there's a lot of synergies and what would I call them? Test cases for like things that might come up.
Yeah.
So that I can choose to use or not use those things. But it's nice to have methods. That's what I like. I like lots of methods for things. And maybe I don't like that method, but it gives me a starting point so that I can change my mind. The thing I like about Rules Cyclopedia is it's full of stuff.
Right.
And it's also built on a very light, streamlined system. I don't see it being a hindrance to the current game we're playing. Even though it's using OSE, it's obviously using the same rules, so I can just or I guess not backdate, but forward date the experience to include these. The things like the proficiency system, the optional classes. I mean, yeah, all of these work the same way. So I'm quite taken with this one. There's things about other editions that I've liked. Obviously, the one I had the biggest exposure to was third edition, or third and then 3.5.
Yes.
Started playing at the end of second edition, but that seems like almost a dream to me. It actually, in all fairness, the very first product, and I've said this before, the very first product role-playing anything I ever played was the Dragon Strike board game.
Oh, yeah.
That was my gateway drug, which was super weird.
Yeah.
It was my friend's stepbrother's game. I guess they had lost the tape, or it was like in their tape collection. So I never saw the tape until way later.
Oh, right. Yes.
The thing that it's famous for.
Yes, right.
Yeah, the video. Yeah, third edition, the more and more time I spend, I think it's full of really, really good ideas, like every edition of D&D, but it's too bloated. The more and more I look back on it, the more I feel it's not a stream. It's trying to be too many things at once and too much at once. It's not as watered down, and I don't mean to say that too much. It's a more fortified concept than 5th edition is, but it's trying to do too much with too many rules. There's the source book problem. There's all these things. 4th edition, I never liked that. It's basically a board game with funny accents, if so chosen. It's way too combat focused, but not in the ways that I like. And as I said, the best version of 4th edition is probably going to end up being Draw Steel.
Right, totally.
I might not run that, but if somebody's running it, I'll play it. I want to know. You know, maybe like I honestly think because Matt Colville's interest in 4th edition, and apparently he likes it, but that he made a better version of that. So I assume that's the best incarnation of that thing.
Right. Yeah.
And then 5th edition just seemed to have tried to learn the lessons of the past and then failed to let any of them sink in. And it's too overpowered for me. I'm just not into it.
So I think there's a lot to take away both from this as a game itself to play, because it's still so well supported through OSR and there's a ton of material for it. And secondly, even if you're not going to play this, the way that you approach the role-playing like milieu with this game in mind is valuable. Like the way that you would interpret running any role-playing game is actually, it's good to have this context to it, because it divorces you from the idea of this like nodal-based plot points that players move down a network through. You know, it completely throws that out the window and makes it much more free form in a way that doesn't take away from any mechanical potentiality, but it also does mean you're not running up against these invisible walls like a video game.
To me, Dungeons and Dragons particularly, but a certain sort of role-playing game, and certainly the way that I run it, it's not a novel. It shouldn't be aggressively simulationist unless you're playing like Twilight 2000.
Right.
But it is meant to provoke a very, like, a lived-in world where plots happen, rather than the characters are the focus of the plot itself. I think there are other games that do that a lot better. Ones that focus on action and drama over, say, a setting-based, so a more character-driven plot as opposed to a setting-based plot. I find Dungeons & Dragons, at least for my liking, especially older editions, lean more into that setting focus. And I have no desire to play something that does that and isn't trying to be a different game the way that Daggerheart or Draw Steel are really buying into that. I think my conclusion about 5th edition and my aversion to it is built into the saying, if you try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one. If it has no vision, then, you know, if everyone is special, then no one is special. But yeah, so I guess that'll conclude our discussion of this. It was maybe a bit more of a ramble, and I didn't feel a lot of need to get into the system per se, because it's Dungeons and Dragons. Most people know what if they don't know the edition, they at least know the concept.
Exactly.
Our next episode is essentially just going to be a continuation of this, talking about the old school Renaissance and its progeny, and the things that have spun off of it. And I guess the desire for what we're talking about that I found in all of these games, which is, I feel like I have a better footing for why that happened. But until then, have a great time around your tables, and happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.